The rancher of Bittercreek. On the highest ground of my ranch behind a fence line, the most powerful family in the county had kept locked for 40 years. I found a row of graves that proved the land under my boots had been stolen from my own blood, and the moment I started asking about it, that family decided a black man asking questions in their county was a problem best solved permanently. They came for my water, my cattle, my name, and eventually for me. If you've ever stood on ground that holds a truth, someone rich would kill to keep buried. Stay with me because the way this ended is the reason I'm the one telling it. And before we start, do me a favor and hit subscribe because some truths only come out of the ground when enough people are willing to dig. My name is Isaiah Ford and I raise horses on a hard, beautiful piece of Montana called Bittercreek. There is no life like it and no life harder. A ranch doesn't care about your feelings or your history or the color of your hands. It cares whether you're up before the sun, whether you can read weather and animals and water, whether you'll go out into a blizzard at 2 in the morning because a mare is foaling and she doesn't know it's inconvenient. My grandfather used to say that land is the only thing that tells the truth because it remembers everything that ever happened on it and it doesn't lie for anybody. I didn't understand how right he was until the land showed me what it had been remembering for 40 years. My family has been in this valley longer than almost anyone, though you'd never know it from the history books. After the Civil War, my great-great-grandfather came west with a wagon and a dream that a black man could own ground in a place big enough that maybe nobody would stop him. He homesteaded here on Bittercreek, proved up the claim the legal way, and built something a working ranch in a valley where a black family owning good land and good water was to certain people an offense against the natural order. I grew up on the stories. And I grew up on the gaps in the stories, the parts my grandfather went quiet about, the way the family holding had somehow shrunk over the generations. The good high ground with the year-round spring, somehow ending up on the other side of the Bannon family's fence. I raised a child of my own on this ranch, mostly alone after his mother passed my son's grown now working horses down in Wyoming. And being the parent who stayed through every hard winter taught me the patience this land demands, which turned out to be exactly the patience it takes to dig up a 40-year lie. The most powerful family in the county was the Bannons. They'd been the cattle kings of the valley for generations, thousands of acres. The bank, the county's commission, the brand inspector, the sheriff who'd been elected with their money. The patriarch was named Wade Bannon, a big weathered man who wore his power like a good hat, comfortable and always on. The Bannon Ranch wrapped around 3 sides of my Bittercreek, and for as long as anyone could remember, the Bannons had made it quietly clear that they considered my family's presence a temporary condition they'd eventually correct. My grandfather held on. My father held on. And when it came to me, Wade Bannon decided the holding on was going to end. It started as these things do in ranch country with water. Bittercreek runs year-round because of a spring up on the high ground, except the high ground with the spring was on the Bannon side of a fence that had been there since before I was born, and the water I depended on came down to me only by an old agreement and the natural flow. And one dry summer, Wade Bannon dammed the spring and diverted it. Legally, he claimed he had papers water rights filed generations back, and in the West, water rights are life and death. Overnight, my creek ran low, my pasture started to brown, and my horses were drinking from a creek that Wade Bannon could shut off like a faucet whenever he chose. He'd found the softest place to squeeze a rancher, which is his water, and he squeezed. I went to see him about it the way a neighbor should, and Wade Bannon received me on the porch of his big house, poured me a whiskey I didn't want, and made me an offer wrapped in concern. Ha said ranching was getting harder for the small operator, that a man alone couldn't fight the droughts in the markets forever, that he'd hate to see me break my back holding on to Bittercreek. And he offered to buy me out a fair price, he called it generous even, and let me walk away with money in my pocket before the land took everything I had. And I understood sitting on that porch that the water hadn't been about water. The water was the pressure. He'd turned off my spring to make me sell, and now he was offering to buy the ranch he'd just made unlivable and calling it a kindness. I said no. I told Wade Bannon that my family had proved up Bittercreek before his family owned a single cow, that it was not for sale, and that I'd like my water turned back on. And Wade Bannon's easy smile didn't move, but something behind it did, something old and cold and certain, and he said, "Your people have been guests in this valley a long time, Isaiah. Long enough. Maybe that you've forgotten you were ever guests." And that word guests on land my great-great-grandfather had homesteaded with his own hands told me everything about what I was really dealing with, and it lit something in me that all his pressure never could. Because I'd spent my whole life wondering about those gaps in my grandfather's stories, and Wade Bannon had just told me without meaning to that the gaps were not gaps, they were wounds, and I decided driving home past his locked fence line that I was going to find out exactly what that fence was keeping in. That's when I climbed up to the high ground for the first time in my life. The spring, the disputed water, it was all on a stretch of benchland behind a Bannon fence that had been padlocked and posted my entire life ground I'd been raised to understand was theirs and to stay off of. But a diverted spring is a legal matter, and I had a right to inspect the water that was mine. So with a lawyer's letter in my pocket, I cut the lock and I walked up onto the highest ground in the county, and I found what 40 years of locked fence had been hiding. I have to tell you what it was like to stand on that high ground for the first time, because I'd been forbidden it my whole life and had never once questioned the forbidding. That's the thing about growing up under a family like the Bannons. The boundaries of your world are drawn so early and so completely that you mistake them for the shape of reality itself. That fence had been there before I was born. My father had stayed off that ground, and his father, and so I had too, and none of us had ever said out loud the question that a free man should have asked from the start. Why is the best ground with the only reliable water on their side of a fence when my family was here first? The answer had been sitting up there the whole time, and no Ford had been allowed to walk up and read it in 3 generations. I stood at the top and looked down over the whole valley. Bittercreek the Bannon spread, wrapping around it, the road the far mountains, and I understood for the first time in my life that the view itself was a lie. I'd been raised inside a map drawn by the winners, and that the truth was up here where they'd made sure no one would look. Graves. A row of them old hand-cut stones half sunk in the grass in a small clearing you couldn't see from any road. And when I knelt and cleared the lichen off the weathered stones, I read names. My names. Ford. My great-great-grandfather's people. A family cemetery on ground the Bannons claimed had always been theirs, which is impossible, because you do not bury your dead on another man's land. You bury them on your own. Those graves were proof carved in stone and sunk in the earth that this high ground with its year-round spring had once belonged to my family, that the Ford homestead had extended up here, and that somewhere along the way the Bannons had taken it, taken the best ground, the water, and left my ancestors' graves locked behind a fence so that no one who might ask questions could ever find them. I knelt in that grass for a long time. I want you to understand what it does to a man to find his own name on a 100-year-old headstone in a place he was raised to believe he had no right to stand. It is grief, and it is fury, and it is strangely a kind of homecoming all at once, because I finally understood who I was and where I came from, and exactly what had been done to us in the not knowing. Gaps my grandfather went quiet at had been its own weight my whole life without my even feeling it until it lifted. And one of those stones told a darker story than theft. My great-great-grandfather's stone gave a year of death that I knew from the family stories was the year the trouble happened, the year the family went quiet about, the year the holding first shrank. He had not died old in his bed. He had died that year, the year the Bannons' land first grew and ours first shrank. And he was buried up here on the ground that became theirs, and I stood over that stone in the Montana wind and understood that I was looking at a crime scene 40 years, no, 100 years cold. The land had been remembering the whole time. It had just been waiting for someone to come up the hill and read it. I started asking questions. That was my mistake, and it was also the only honorable thing to do. I went to the county records, to the old land office filings, to the historical society. And the moment I started pulling on the thread of how Bannon land had grown while Ford land shrank in that specific year, the whole county seemed to close around me like a fist. Wade Bannon found out within days the county was his after all, and everything changed. The pressure stopped being about water and started being about survival. First, the legal machine. A survey suddenly discovered that my cattle handling facilities encroached on Bannon land, and I was served. My grazing lease on some adjacent public land held by my family for generations came up for a review that stalled it into uselessness, and I learned the review board had Bannon money all over it. Then the brand inspector, A Bannon man flagged my herd, and one morning I woke to find that several of my horses had been reported as bearing altered brands, the setup for a rustling accusation. The oldest and most dangerous charge in cattle country, a hanging offense in the old days, and a felony still. Someone had been on my land in the night, altering evidence, building a case to make me not a wronged man, but a criminal. It's the same play: the powerful run everywhere, turn the victim into the suspect before he can be believed. And then it turned violent, because it always does, with men who believe the land is theirs by right of blood. My fences were cut and my horses scattered across the highway at night, a thing that can kill animals and drivers both. My hay barn burned arson, everyone knew it, though the Bannon sheriff wrote it up as undetermined. And one evening, two men I didn't know were waiting at my gate, and they told me without quite saying anything I could prove that the high country had always been Bannon land, that a smart man didn't go digging up old bones, and that Montana was a big lonesome place where a man ranching alone could disappear into a canyon and not be found till spring. And I want to be honest about how alone it felt, because that loneliness was the Bannon's oldest and best weapon, sharpened over 100 years. When your fences are cut, you call the sheriff, and the sheriff is theirs, and he writes it up as your poor fence keeping. When your barn burns, you call the fire investigator, and the finding comes back undetermined. When you're framed for rustling, you look for a lawyer, and the good ones in the county all do business with the Bannons and are suddenly too busy. Every institution a wronged man is supposed to be able to turn to had been quietly bought or cowed a generation before I ever needed it, so that when my turn came I would reach for help and close my hand on air and conclude the way they wanted me to conclude, that there was no point, that this was just how it was, that a Ford could not win against a Bannon in Bannon's county. That's the real inheritance. A family like that builds not the land, the helplessness. They make sure that by the time you understand what's being done to you, every door you might run to has already been locked from the other side years before, so that your defeat feels less like a crime against you and more like the weather. For a while that autumn, I believed the weather. I sat in my kitchen that autumn, 50 years old. My water dammed my herd under a rustling cloud. My barn ashes, my ancestors' graves locked behind an enemy's fence, and I felt the full weight of 100 years pressing down. Because this wasn't just Wade Bannon against Isaiah Ford. This was the same fist that had closed on my great-great-grandfather, reaching across a century to close on me, and for a while up on that hard ground alone I believed it would. I believed the land would tell its truth to the wind and no one would ever hear it, and that I'd be one more Ford buried by the Bannons and forgotten. The woman who wouldn't let that happen drove up my road in a mud-caked truck with a vet box on the back, and she was the last person I'd have expected to stand against the most powerful family in the county, because half that county was her clientele. Her name was Sam Rourke, Dr. Samantha Rourke, the valley's large animal veterinarian, the one who pulled calves at 3 in the morning and stitched up horses torn on barbed wire and knew every ranch in 50 miles because she'd had her arm inside most of the animals on them. She was in her early 40s, weathered and blunt, and entirely without fear of large dangerous creatures or large dangerous men. A white woman from an old ranching family that had lost their own place a generation back and knew exactly what it was to be squeezed off the land. I knew her because she was my vet, and a good one, and we had the plain-spoken trust of two people who'd worked together over sick animals in bad weather. But we weren't close. There wasn't room. The work was too hard. She came up my road the night after my horses were scattered on the highway, because I'd called her to treat the ones that came back cut and lame, and she worked over them till dawn, and as the sun came up, she looked at the wire that had been cleanly cut, not broken, and she looked at me and she said, "Somebody did this on purpose. This isn't a fence failing. This is a message." And I've been the vet in this valley 20 years. Isaiah long enough to know a Bannon message when I see one, because I've watched them run people off this land my whole life, and everybody just lets them because they own the sheriff and the bank and half our mortgages. She wiped her hands. So I'm going to ask you something, and I want the truth. What did you find up on that high ground? Because the whole county's whispering that you cut Wade Bannon's lock, and Wade Bannon doesn't burn a man's barn over a padlock. So I told her the graves, the names, the stone with the year of the trouble, the 100-year-old theft the land had been holding. And Sam Rourke listened to all of it, and she didn't gasp and she didn't cry. She got very quiet, and then she said the thing that pulled me up off the floor of that 100-year wait. So they didn't just take your family's land. They killed for it, and they've been sitting on the graves for a century, and now they're doing the same thing to you. They did to your great-great-grandfather, betting the county will look away like it always has. Well, I know this valley better than Wade Bannon knows it because I've been in the barns he never goes into, and there are a lot of people in those barns who are tired of being afraid of that family. You've got the graves, Isaiah, I've got the county. Let's go dig up the truth before they bury you with it. Here is what we built the rancher and the vet out of nothing but old stones and older records and a valley full of people who'd been afraid for too long. Sam was right that the graves alone were the key because graves are not opinions. They are physical, datable, legally significant facts, and you cannot bury your dead on land you don't own. We brought in carefully and quietly a forensic archaeologist and a historian who specialized in exactly this. The erased history of black homesteaders in the West, the systematic ways their land had been stolen through violence and fraudulent paperwork, and the simple confidence that no one would ever check. The graves properly documented established that the Ford homestead had extended onto the high ground, and the historian digging into the county's own century-old records, the ones Wade Bannon's family had assumed no one would ever cross-reference, found the fraud, the sale of the high ground from my great-great-grandfather to the first Bannon, filed the same year as his death, signed with a mark by a man the records elsewhere showed could read and write, and always signed his full name. A forged deed, 100 years old, sitting in the county archive the whole time because the Bannons had been so certain of their power that they'd never bothered to destroy it. Wade Bannon fought back with everything a century of accumulated power could bring, and the fighting showed the true shape of the family. When he learned Sam was helping me, the pressure came for her ranchers who'd used her for 20 years. Suddenly, in the same week, found other vets. The Bannons put out word that Dr. Rourke had taken sides, and in a county they controlled that could end a practice. She kept working the ranches that would still have her, and never once flinched. When the historian started pulling records of fire, undetermined, again damaged a section of the county archive, though not before we'd photographed and certified copies of everything that mattered because Sam had insisted we document first and celebrate later. The rustling case against me was pushed toward charges. And there was a night my truck was run off a mountain road by a vehicle with no plates, and I went into the ditch and walked away only because I ranched these roads and knew how to ride it out. That was the night I told Sam I couldn't keep risking her, that Bannon would burn her whole life down to get to me. And Sam Rourke, sitting in my kitchen with a cut over her eye from helping pull me out of the ditch, said the thing that carried me the rest of the way. Isaiah, they've been running people off this land for 100 years by making sure everybody stands alone. Your great-great-grandfather stood alone. I'll bet the Rourkes stood alone when they lost our place too. The only thing that's different this time, the only thing is that you're not alone and they can't stand it. So no, I'm not backing off. I'm the difference between this time and every other time, and I intend to stay the difference. I want to tell you about the old man, because his coming forward was the bravest thing I saw in the whole fight. His name was Cyrus, and he was near 90, and he'd worked the Bannon Ranch for 60 years, a lifetime of loyalty to the family, or what looked like loyalty and was really just the only life a poor man in that valley had been allowed. He drove up my road one afternoon, slow and careful, and he sat in my kitchen a long time before he could get the words out, because what he was about to do was betray the only world he'd ever known. And then he told me. His own father had been a young hand on the Bannon place the year of the trouble, and had seen the first Bannon and 2 other men ride up to the Ford homestead on the high ground, and had heard the shots and had been there when they moved the fence line down the mountain the next spring and told everyone the Fords had sold out and moved on. His father had carried it his whole life and never dared speak it, and had passed it to his son like a stone, and Cyrus had carried it 60 more years. I'm too old to be scared of them now, he told me, his hands shaking around the coffee cup. And I've been ashamed my whole life that my daddy saw it and I said nothing. I'd like to die having said it. Your people were murdered for that ground, Isaiah. I've known it since I was a boy. I'm sorry it took me 80 years to be brave enough to tell you. I have thought about Cyrus a great deal, about how the powerful don't just steal from the people they crush, they steal from the witnesses. 2 decades of silence and shame, whole lives spent carrying a truth they were too afraid to set down. Cyrus set his down in my kitchen, and it was the beginning of the end for the Bannons. The break came as it always does from inside, from the people the powerful are certain will stay loyal. Wade Bannon's whole century of dominance ran on the silence of the valley, and the valley, it turned out, was full of people holding pieces of the truth, waiting for someone to go first. An old man who'd worked the Bannon ranch his whole life, near the end of it now, and unafraid of them anymore, came to me because he'd heard I'd found the graves. And he told me a story his own father had told him, the true story of the year of the trouble, the killing on the high ground, the family that vanished from the top of the valley. The brand inspector's assistant, sickened by being asked to help frame me quietly, told the truth about who'd really reported my brands as altered and when. And a young sheriff's deputy, one honest man in a bot department, had documented the barn fire and the fence cutting properly against orders and kept his own file. Every piece of Wade Bannon's century-old crime and his brand-new one had a person attached to it, and people, when they finally see that they're not the only one, stop being afraid all at once. We took it the graves, the forged deed, the historian's report, the old man's testimony, the deputy's file past the county Wade Bannon owned and into the hands of the state, because a 100-year-old land fraud and a present-day campaign of arson and intimidation are not local matters, and the state attorney general's office does not answer to the Bannon ranch. And once the state moved, and once the first witnesses saw that the ceiling didn't fall on them, the whole century-old silence broke. The case that came together did not just save Bittercreek, it broke the Bannons. The forged deed was invalidated, and the high ground, the graves, the spring, the water was restored to my family where it had belonged for 100 years. The rustling frame collapsed the moment an honest investigator looked at it. And Wade Bannon, along with the men who'd done his night work, was charged arson, conspiracy, witness intimidation. And when the old crime was finally exhumed alongside the old bones, the state opened an inquiry into the killing on the high ground that the Bannon family had buried under a fence for a century. He was too powerful, everyone had always said, too woven into the county to ever fall. But power that runs on everyone agreeing to look away collapses the instant they stop, and the whole valley finally stopped. I saw Wade Bannon one last time before the trial, and I want to tell you about it because it's the moment I understood I had already won. He came up my road himself, the great man who never came to anyone, and he stood at my gate in his good hat, and he dropped the concern and the whiskey porch friendliness. He offered me money, a staggering amount, to let the graves stay quiet, to accept a settlement of the water dispute, and drop my historical claims, to let his family's story stay the story. And when I said no, the mask came off entirely, and I saw the thing that had run this valley for 100 years. He said, "You people have a talent for not knowing when you've been beaten. My family built this valley. We made it worth something. Your great-grandfather was squatting on ground he couldn't hold, and we put it to use, and that's how it's always worked and always will. You dig up those bones, all you'll prove is that the strong take what the weak can't keep." And I looked at Wade Bannon, and I felt strangely calm, because he'd just told me to my face that he knew exactly what his family had done and believed they'd had the right. I said, "My great-great-grandfather held that ground just fine, Wade. Your family didn't take it because he couldn't hold it. You took it because he could, and it shamed you that a black man had better water than you did. That's not strength. That's the oldest weakness there is, and the bones you're so worried about aren't going to prove you're strong. They're going to prove you're a murderer's grandson standing on a grave." He got back in his truck. He didn't threaten me. He just drove away, and I watched him go, and I knew the fence had already fallen, even though it would take the law another year to say so. I testified at his trial. His lawyer tried to make the 100-year-old graves into ancient history irrelevant, the grievance of a man reaching into the distant past to explain his own failures. And I said, "There's nothing distant about it. That family dammed my water this summer, burned my barn this fall, ran me off a mountain road 3 weeks ago. They didn't stop doing to me what they did to my great-great-grandfather. They never stopped, not for 100 years, and the only reason we're finally in a room where it counts is that this time somebody found the bones. The past isn't past in this valley. It's just been winning so long everybody mistook it for the way things are." And Wade Bannon, who had never in his life been contradicted in a room he was in, looked down because the land had finally been allowed to testify, and the land does not lie for kings. Wade Bannon was convicted. The cattle king who told me my family were guests in the valley learned that the land does not recognize kings, and neither, once it was finally allowed to look, did the law. The Bannon empire came apart in the light, the bank, the commission, the sheriff who'd covered for them, all of it unwound as the century of quiet corruption it had really been. And on the highest ground in the county, the graves of my family sit now behind no fence at all, cleared and tended with a marker that tells the true story so that everyone who comes to that beautiful high place knows who homesteaded it, who was killed for it, and who came home to it. Now I've told you about the fight. Let me tell you about Sam, because somewhere between the graves and the water, I found the thing I'd stopped believing a hard life had left room for. There was a night that turned it, though I was too weathered a man to name it then. We'd been out late doctoring the horses that came home cut, and afterward, Sam sat on my porch steps and told me about the Rourke place, the ranch her family had lost when she was a girl. Not to the Bannons directly, but to the same kind of squeeze a bad year, a bank that called the note early, a bigger neighbor who bought it cheap out of the wreckage. She told me about this day they drove away from it, her father not speaking, her mother crying, and how she'd decided as a girl that she'd find a way to stay on this land even if she couldn't own it. Which is how she became the vet, the one person who gets to set foot on every ranch in the valley, welcome everywhere, belonging nowhere. I've spent 20 years with my arm inside other people's animals on land that used to feel like it could have been anybody's, including ours, she said. And I watched families get squeezed off one at a time, and I told myself it wasn't my fight because I didn't have a place to lose anymore. Then you found those graves, Isaiah, and I realized I'd been a coward dressed up as a professional. This is my fight. It's been my fight since I was 9 years old in the back of a truck watching our place get smaller in the window. And she looked at me in the porch light and said, "You gave me back a reason to stop just patching people up and start actually fighting for the ground." I didn't say anything foolish. But that was the night I understood that Sam Rourke and I were grieving the same country from two different wounds, and that neither of us had ever expected to find someone who understood the size of it. We fell in love the slow way, the only way two weathered people who've buried a lot of hope can over sick animals and old records and long cold nights without noticing until one day you can't picture the ranch or the morning without the other person's truck in the yard. For most of that year, I didn't let myself see it. I was a man fighting a century-old fist, and she was the one person standing in it with me, and you don't examine your own heart in the middle of a war for your land. But somewhere in all those nights, watching Sam Rourke risk a 20-year practice, her whole livelihood, in a county that could end her, to stand up for a truth in the ground that wasn't even her family's, I understood that I had found the rarest thing there is. A person who knew exactly what it cost to lose your land to men like the Bannons, and who had decided that this time in this valley the losing was going to stop, and who'd chosen to make my fight hers because she could not stand to watch it happen one more time. She was as tough as the country and twice as honest, and she'd never once treated me like a man she was helping. She treated me like a man she was standing beside. She never let me be grateful, which is how I knew. When I tried in my clumsy way to thank her for saving Bittercreek, she looked up from doctoring a mare and said, "Isaiah, I didn't save your ranch. Your ancestors saved your ranch. They had the decency to be buried on their own land, which is the one thing the Bannons couldn't forge. I just helped you read the ground, and I didn't do it for you. I did it because I have watched that family take this valley apart my whole life. One lonely rancher at a time, starting with my own people, and I was done watching. You gave me the first fight I ever thought we could win. That's not me doing you a favor. That's you handing me back something I'd given up on." And I looked at this woman who'd lost her own land to the same kind of men and never stopped loving the valley anyway, and I understood that the two of us had been grieving the same country from two different wounds, and that we'd finally found in each other the one person who understood exactly what the ground was worth. The evening the high ground came home to my family after the state people had gone and the news trucks had left, Sam and I rode up to the graves together at sunset, and I told her the truth. I'd been too busy fighting to say that she was the toughest and truest person I'd ever known, and that after a life of holding this land alone, the thing I most wanted was to not hold it alone anymore, and that I wanted it to be her. And Sam Rourke, who is not a woman given to softness, got something in her eyes she'd blame on the wind, and she said, "About time, Ford. I've been pulling your horses out of ditches for a year." And then she kissed me up on the high ground in the sunset over the graves of the people who'd homesteaded it, and 100 years of Ford grief finally turned on that spot into something like joy. The restoration of the high ground became something bigger than my ranch, and I'm proud of that part. The historian who'd worked our case used it to open up a whole buried history because it turned out the Fords were not the only black homesteading family that had vanished from that region under suspicious circumstances a century back, their land absorbed into bigger spreads, their stories erased from the county's official memory. Our graves cracked open a door, and other descendants started coming forward, other families whose grandparents had gone quiet about the same kinds of gaps. It became a real reckoning, a documented history of how the West's land had actually changed hands, taught now, marked now with the names put back. My great-great-grandfather, who died in the grass for the crime of owning good water, has a proper marker at last and a place in the true history of the valley instead of a forged mark on a stolen deed. Cyrus lived to see it. He came up to the high ground the day the graves were rededicated 90 years old, and he stood at the stone of the man his father had watched die, and he wept, and he told me it was the first easy breath he'd taken in 80 years. He passed that winter, and we buried him at his request up on the high ground near the men his father had failed to save, and he at the end did not. She keeps her practice. The county that tried to end her came crawling back once the Bannons fell, and she makes them wait now, which I enjoy more than I should. We run Bittercreek together, the rancher and the vet, and it's whole again, the water and the high ground and the graves, all of it back under the family name for the first time in a century. My son came up from Wyoming to see the restored high country and stood at his ancestors' graves and cried, and I understood that I hadn't just saved a ranch. I'd closed a wound that had been open for 100 years. We married up on the high ground, of course. Where else? The following summer by the graves with the spring running free again beside us, and the whole valley invited, including the families who'd started coming forward with their own buried histories. My son gave me away in a manner of speaking and stood at his ancestors' stones with his own children's future finally secure on ground that would stay in the family. Sam wore her good boots and no veil and told the preacher to keep it short because there were horses to check, which is the truest thing I can tell you about the woman I married. And every spring now, we ride up to the high ground and tend the graves, and I tell the old stories with the gaps filled in at last, and Sam holds my hand over the stone of the man who was killed for this ground, and I think he knows. I think the land told him. The land tells everything eventually to whoever's willing to come up the hill and read it. I think about my grandfather up there and the way he'd go quiet at the gaps, and I understand him better now than I did when he was alive. He knew. Some part of him always knew there was a truth up on that high ground, and he'd made the calculation that a poor black rancher makes in a valley run by men like the Bannons, that digging it up would get his family killed, and that holding on, staying quiet, surviving, was its own kind of victory to hand down. He wasn't wrong to make that choice in his time, but he raised me stubborn, and he raised me to love the land enough to finally ask it the question he couldn't afford to. And I like to think that when I cut that lock and walked up the hill, some part of him walked up with me, finally free to go look. A powerful family stole my blood's land, killed for it, and hid the proof behind a fence for 100 years, certain that a black man in their county would never dig it up, and that if he did, no one would ever believe him. But my grandfather taught me that the land remembers everything and lies for nobody, and a vet who'd lost her own land. Taught me that the only thing that ever beats them is refusing finally to stand alone, and it turned out that the ground had kept the truth safe for a century in stone and bone, just waiting for someone stubborn enough to come home and read it. Wade Bannon thought the land was his by blood. He learned too late that the land keeps its own books older than any deed, and that the dead he buried to steal it were the very witnesses who took it back. 100 years his family sat on those graves, certain no Ford would ever climb the hill and read them. It only took one. It always only takes one. If this story dug into something in you, do me that favor from the start. Subscribe, because some truths only come out of the ground when enough people are willing to dig and tell me in the comments. Is there a truth about your own family? The powerful tried to bury. I read every single one. And stay close. The next story I've got begins in a courtroom where the man everyone had already convicted was the only one telling the truth, and the lawyer who believed him had everything to lose, and it holds you to the very last word.